And let's get moving. So good morning, buongiorno, everybody out there. I see some faces that, yes, I see you, Nancy, who I have seen on the road and has a lot of connections to the Veneto. I see a lot of familiar faces. Patricia, who's coming to us, I think from Italy, actually. And Stephanie, who I have some fond memories of traveling with. So we have lots of new friends and friends that are familiar. So let's go ahead and get our presentation up and running. Okay. All right, so today's theme is understanding Venice. How do we understand something that's difficult to understand? Because you think you understand it. This is the thing that I think is amazing about Venice. People think they understand it because you've seen beautiful photographs like this. You've seen gondolas, you've seen sunsets, you think about Casanova, you think you know the story. You see the people with the masks and you go, yeah, Venice, it's a city on water, it's neat, it's a place that tourists like to go. And it's true, it is. But it is also a city where people do still live and work. However, as I mentioned, the number of people that live there is quite a bit smaller than the past. And when we speak about Venice as a city today, we don't speak about the island. So the island of Venice is 118 separate islands, individual islands. But if you look at statistics for how many people actually live in Venice right now, it's over 200,000. The amount of people who actually live within the city on the island, those are really the only people who I think are true Venetians on the island or one of the islands of the lagoon. But most of the figures you see include people on the mainland, people who live in Mestre, in Mira, in Fusina, all these other little villages that are on the mainland. So Venice as a city itself is very small. It's sort of like a little country town. Since I know my way around it, I can walk across town in about 15 minutes. I can get from the train station down to St. Mark's or to Castello, 15, 20 minutes easy. I think if you were to walk, it would take you about 3 or 4 hours because, you know, it's Venice and it doesn't make sense. The maps don't make any sense. But that's why they have the water buses like that. And that's how you kind of get around town. If you haven't been there before, they do have public transportation and they try to make it as modern as possible. But I would say probably the most striking thing for any visitor, the very first thing you see when you walk out is water. And I know that if I tell you this, if you've never been to Venice, you know that intellectually, but when you actually see it, it's stunning because it looks as if the city is floating on the water. A lot of people think that's true, actually, that the city was somehow put on pontoons or it was, you know, built in the middle of water, but actually it's not true at all. It's built on islands. And, you know, when we go to Venice, we love doing the touristy things. We love getting on the gondolas, and the gondolas are an important part of it, but those actually also have a historical function. The gondolas were the only way to get between these islands. So in the past, if we go back 200, 300, 400 years, the only way that people could get across town to see their friends is with the gondola. So my walk from the train station to Castello would not have been possible in the past without a gondola because there were no bridges. You see those bridges in that photograph. They didn't exist until the 1800s. So each individual island was its own community. It had its own church, its own cistern. It had its own sort of, you know, town meeting place. So every single one of these little islands was in effect its own community that could have been isolated on its own. And to get from community to community, you had to have a gondola. So that's why the gondolas exist. It's not just a touristic thing in the past. It was a necessity. And the reason I always get my groups out on the gondolas is not because it's romantic and touristy. Okay, sure. I mean, there is romance there sometimes. But the point of it is when you take a gondola through the city, you see the city the way it was meant to be seen because you're seeing the fronts of buildings. When we walk on the bridges, we never see the front of a building. The front door faces the canal. So just something to keep in mind, the canal is the street and people use that like a street all the time. And they always had their own boat to get them from place to place. So very different thing than today. Today here, I have to show you this. This was very funny when I was out in September taking little video clips. This guy, look, he's got a stroller on the gondola. And he notices me filming him. In the stroller is a dog. And this cracked me up because I think this is so clearly the way things probably were in the past. This is modern life mimicking the past. If you can imagine a wealthy man dressed with a wig and kind of fancy outfit with a dog on a gondola, you're a whole lot closer to the way Venice actually was in the distant past. The problem is, how do we keep Venice alive? How do we hold it up? Do we build big hands like this coming out of the water? This is from the Biennale a few years ago, and it was a statement on the fact that Venice they think it's sinking. It's not really sinking, but it is deteriorating and it's got some problems. So what is the best way for us to help Venice? And I think what we're going to do today is the best way. Understanding Venice and understanding why it's an important city is important to being able to preserve it. Because when we go back and we look at the scope of history, what was the most important city in the entire Western world in, I don't know, about the year 1300? It was Venice. It was the most wealthy city. It had basically the same number of billionaires that we have in Seattle right now lived in Venice, probably more. It was incredibly wealthy in a way that it's difficult for us to understand today. And it was the centerpiece that connected East and West. So just keep that in mind as we go through Venice today, is understanding that this city was much more important than we think. We think Paris was important, London was important. Those were important, yeah, but they were important more recently. Venice was the light of the Middle Ages. There were no dark ages in Venice. They never happened. So let's find out why. Why would you live in the lagoon? Venice, as I said, is made up of 118 individual islands. It used to be 117 in the past when they added you can see the ugly place at the end, which is the parking lot. That's the Tronchetto. So each of those tiny little blocks, they look like city blocks, but they are individual islands. The city was started, you can see right here in the middle, there's a little dot, and that is the Rialto right in the center. If you threw a dart, you could hit it. We always like to say Venice looks like a fish. It kind of does. I don't think it was intentional. It just happens to look like a fish. And the joke I always think of is that, you go in at the mouth, you go down the Grand Canal, which looks like the intestines, and you come out at the end. And right at the end where you come out of the intestines, that's where the political center is. So I think that it was an unintentional allegory on politics. So the city of Venice itself has grown a lot. That initial stone of Rialto, that centerpiece, was the very first part of the town, and that was laid about 1,600 years ago. And in fact, the 1,600th birthday of the city of Venice is in 12 days, 11 days. It's March 25th. So on March 25th, you can get a little cupcake out and blow a candle out for Venice, because it will turn 1,600 years old. And I love that every Venetian will tell you that it started at noon. They know exactly the date and the time too. So it started at noon, exactly 1,600 years ago. It wasn't this big to begin with though. And what you have to imagine is that it was a pretty rough lifestyle when they first moved there. So where were the Venetians during ancient Rome? They didn't exist. Venice did not exist at all during the ancient Roman times. And actually, it was sandwiched between two major Roman cities. We had Verona, which is over to the east. And then we also had Aquileia, which is an important city in Roman times, and then will continue throughout the Middle Ages to be important because it's the seat of the patriarchy, which I'll get to a little bit later. So sandwiched in between, we just had this muddy lagoon where a whole bunch of different rivers converged. So the ancient Romans never built a city there. Why would you? There was no reason. The only thing that we know for sure that the ancient Romans did is that they went to the lagoon for fishing, and they went to collect small fish to make something that is essentially like a Thai fish sauce. It was a condiment in Roman cuisine that was quite valuable. So we know that there was Roman activity because they wanted to collect this particular kind of fish to make this particular kind of sauce. But other than that, we really don't have much in the way of activity. So it's kind of important to understand exactly where is Venice in the scope of all of these, the movements during the ancient times. And if you look at these couple of maps, I just wanted to show you that the important thing to know about Venice is its position has always been perfect. It's always been perfect to be a place where it's a jumping off point between East and West. So you can kind of see where the Roman Empire was at the 1st century BC. You see Venetians, the people were called Venetians, but they were the mainlanders, but the lagoon itself didn't exist at all. But note on that map, you can see Aquileia there. That is a very important city that is not that important now, and most people who are travelers don't even go there, but that was one of the most important Roman cities at the time. So it was sandwiched in between a couple of very important cities. And then the other map just shows a bunch of routes, trade routes and roads, the way people got around the Roman Empire. And again, Aquileia shows up. It's an important city, and it keeps showing up because it was one of the major Roman cities. So you can kind of already tell just from the way people flow around Europe, even during Roman times, that Venice is going to be important. It's the way that you can get from Northern Europe out to the Mediterranean. If you just look at that map, look at Germany, look at the Alps, what you may not know is really close to Verona is the Brenner Pass. The Brenner Pass is the easiest way to get from Northern Europe down into Italy, and it's been there since Roman times. It was actually a pass that was created and crafted by the Romans. You can go and walk on Roman stones on the Brenner Pass next to the McDonald's at the rest stop. Actually, it still exists. I take my groups there all the time. So that's how people in the past, in the Roman times, would get between Germany or Gaul or wherever and down into Italy. It makes sense then, if you're trying to move goods and you're a Roman from, let's say, Gaul, and you want to move them out to, I don't know, Carthage, it would make sense that you would go to that point around Aquileia and you'd want to set out on a boat because boats are much faster than going by road. So that's why this is going to become an important spot, and why Venice is always going to have an advantage over all of its competitors. It's right at the bottom of a very important pass. So there's the city of Aquileia now. Not a whole lot left there, but it was a major city. And what's going to be important later on, and just to kind of give you a little peek at the future here, is that Aquileia, while it was an important Roman city, it's going to get a thing called a patriarch. This is a little bit of a complicated situation, but the Catholics in the Catholic Church, we don't technically have patriarchs. It is an Eastern Orthodox thing to have these it's like a cardinal almost, but there are these cities in Catholic Italy that still have patriarchs because they are a legacy of this blended history of Byzantine and Catholic history. So that's why this is an important city. It was sort of like a mini pope. I guess you can call a patriarch a mini pope. So they had a mini pope in Aquileia starting from a very, very early time. And this is going to influence a lot of what happens in the area and influence why people are going to build the city of Venice. So what changes everything? Attila the Hun in 452 is going to be the catalyst that's going to start Venice off. There are two factors that are really important. It's essentially, why would you go into a lagoon? Why would you live in the middle of a swamp? Because essentially it was a swamp if you go back to the 400s. Well, people who are desperate, they're going to move into a swamp. And that's exactly what they did. It was people fleeing danger. So around the year 400, we had, of course, what we call the fall of Rome. 410 and 476 are the dates for the fall of the actual city of Rome. But why did it fall? Well, it had been abandoned, first of all. Everybody had moved to Constantinople. And then we had invasions from the Goths, the Visigoths, the Vandals, the Lombards. They're going to be an important tribe. And then Attila the Hun. The Huns are coming as well. All of these different tribes are migrating into Italy, and they're terrorizing the population. Centralized government has left Italy. The centralized government has gone to the east, to Constantinople. And so there's not really anybody watching the store, you know. So these people are desperate and they don't know what to do. So they start to kind of slowly move where they can protect themselves. And they know that if they go out into a watery lagoon, pretty sure that the Huns don't have boats with them. And that was a really safe thing for them to do. So that was what they started to do. And the story kind of goes like this. Attila the Hun came from the east, obviously, and he was slowly making his way into Italy. When he got to Aquileia, he sieged the city. He held on to the city for, I think it was over 30 days. It was a long time. He held on to the city, and he was waiting for the right opportunity to go in. When they finally went in, the city was basically destroyed. He completely razed the city. And the next city over, which was a village called Altino, was watching this with some despair, thinking, well, when he's done with Aquileia, he's coming for us. And instead of waiting for him, what this village did was they decided to just pack up and move. So they packed up everything and they moved out into the Venetian lagoon, not to where Venice is today, but to an island called Torchello. You might have been there before. There's a very beautiful church there, but they moved out, and they moved out not with just their bags, but with everything, including their buildings. So Attila the Hun, just to complete his story, he does eventually come by that way. He continues down into Italy. He's met eventually by the Pope. And this is one of the great sort of mysteries of Attila the Hun, is that he actually had a meeting with the Pope sometime later. They went into a tent together. When they came out, Attila the Hun turned around and decided to go home. This is considered a great miracle in the Catholic Church. And if you go to St. Peter's, you can see a mural of this event. A little further historical information, he died the way a lot of people during that time died. He got bitten by a mosquito and he got sick and died of malaria. So great men sometimes don't have slightly less famous means of dying. So some people look at that as being an act of God, though. Maybe the Pope brought that on. So it's a different way of looking at it. So here's that little town of Altino. If you go there today, this is all you find. You find the roads. And the reason is because those people were so determined to get out of there and get away from these tribes, because it wasn't just the Huns, it was more tribes coming, that they packed their entire city up brick by brick. And they moved it out into the lagoon. They put these things on boats and they moved right out. This is by the Venice airport. You actually probably have driven by it if you've landed at the Venice airport. So very, very close to the lagoon. They just shipped all their buildings to this island. So if you have a look at this, I think immediately the first thought is this a great place to build a house? I'm not sure about that, because a couple of different things. As an architect, I look at this and think that foundation is probably not going to be very solid. That's going to be some squishy land. But also look how swampy it is. It's very swampy. And again, back then, one of the great mysteries was people dying of bad air, malaria, bad air, which was, as we know now, mosquitoes. So not maybe the best pick, but this is how desperate people were. So they moved out here onto Torchello. They brought all of their buildings with them. And over the process of a couple hundred years, they turned this farming island into a city of about 20,000 people, which was quite a lot of people back during that time. So this is the time when we think the Dark Ages are starting. The problem, though, of course, is that as beautiful as Torchello is, it was really, really bad as far as the wind. So when you go into the lagoon, the winds are different everywhere. The temperature, the climate, everything about that spot varies. Murano is different from Murano, which is different from Sant'Erasmo. They all have a different character and a different pattern of wind. And unfortunately, Torchello does not get good wind. And so that's how they have stagnation. And also it's very shallow, so very stagnant, and they had a lot of cases of malaria. So they decided that this was not a good place to live. Now, when you look at this island now, you can tell there's not enough buildings for 20,000 people, right? Well, those people from Altino that moved every single stone from their village to Torchello did it again. They packed up every single building and they transferred it from Torchello to another location. So they kept moving all around the lagoon, trying to figure out what was the better location. Today, this is all we have left of their time there, and that is Santa Maria Assunta, one of the most beautiful churches and one of the oldest that you'll find in Italy. This church is from about 600, added onto over time, and there's really nothing outside of ancient Rome that can compare age-wise to this particular church. So it's really something that's quite a treasure. I remember studying this in architecture school because it's really an interesting piece from a time period that we don't associate with great architecture. Most people think between 400 and 800, nothing happened in Europe. How many times were you told that in your history classes? It was the Dark Ages and, you know, all the Romans died all of a sudden and nothing happened until Michelangelo popped out of Athena's brain. It was just death, nothing, you know. That's not true. A lot of things did happen, and some great architecture did happen in this area for a variety of reasons. Inside, you can see these beautiful mosaics. And this is one of the things I'll continue to come back to, is that this idea that Middle Age art was not good isn't true. This is art from the Middle Ages, influenced by the East in Constantinople. And I'll get in a second to why that is. There's a huge influence from the Far East. Of course, I always have to show everybody this. This is one of my favorite mosaics anywhere. They had a very funny idea of who was going to be damned. If you look, you see the Antichrist, and you see the devil sitting on a throne, and all of those little people that are kind of gathered up around them are kings, Byzantine emperors, popes. So they had a thing against politicians even back 1,000 years ago. Hang on just a second. We've got a person trying to get in. Okay. So that's the Torchello story. And now, I mean, you can look at it and see that it's an absolutely stunning idea that they had in those times when they had zero technology, that they were able to bring a city here and then transport it out across the lagoon to another spot, just using tools that were pretty rudimentary. So it was a pretty impressive thing. When you go and you look at buildings on a place like Torchello, though, what's quite interesting is you see fragments of ancient Rome. And it's always interesting to look and see what you find. And this is in Murano, actually, on the Murano Basilica. You can see that these are all marble fragments from ancient Roman monuments. So it was very typical during this early Middle Ages time when people would go to ancient Roman sites. They'd go to a theater, to a governmental building. This stuff didn't mean anything to them anymore, so they'd pull the colorful marble off. When they did, often the colorful marbles would shatter into 1,000 pieces, and they would use them to make these patchwork quilt style floors. So in the Torchello Cathedral and in the cathedral on Murano, look down when you go in, because these are the most interesting pieces. These are the oldest pieces. It's recycling. So if anybody tells you Italians aren't good at recycling, they're wrong. They invented it. So this is really how ancient Rome moves around Venice, and we still have evidence of that today. So they moved, you can kind of see on this map up here, if you go to the very top of that map, you can see where that village of Altino was. And then where it says Burano, that's right where Torchello is. They moved down to Torchello. Then they tried something else. They moved out to Malamocco, which is on what we call the Lido today. And they established a city there. And in fact, that city was pretty, successful, except for one important problem. That bar, that sandbar, if you put your city there, anybody approaching you from the Adriatic can attack you directly, right? When you look at this defensively, if you're building a defensive city and using the water as your walls, it seems pretty obvious the place you want to be is not on the sandbar that faces the open sea. You want to be inside of that lagoon. So after realizing that, after being attacked, they decided that moving from Malamocco, which is the Lido today, back into the center of the lagoon was a much better defensible idea. So they went to that original spot where they laid stones in the 400s of Rialto around the year 800 and decided that this was the most defensible location. And it's genius too, because if you look at this map, you can see that there are already kind of sketched out canals. And this is something you probably know already about the Venetian lagoon, but everything that's behind that Lido bar is incredibly shallow. I always tell people, if you fall out of a gondola, stand up, because typically you're going to be knee deep in water. And you can see if you go out in boats today, if you come with me sometime and I take you out into the lagoon, sometimes you'll see people in corners of the lagoon that look quite deep wearing hip boots, and they're out there trying to find shellfish. It looks deep, but it really, really is not. On average, it's about knee deep. So if you have a boat, it's actually quite complicated because you have to know where those canals are. These days, not so much. They have them staked out. They have these pilings, and you need to stay between those pilings. But if you were an invader and you were trying to get to the city of Venice and you came into the lagoon, it would look like the sea in front of you. And of course, with a big V-shaped hull on a boat, you're going to go in there and it's not going to turn out very well for you. And that's a lesson that's going to be learned just shortly here by the Frankish emperors. All right, how is Venice built? So the why we understand now, it was people who were essentially refugees. They were trying to get away from the tribes, particularly the Lombards. When the Lombards attack, They're more vicious because the Huns and the Goths and the Visigoths, they attacked villages in the country. They attacked unfortified places and terrorized the countryside. The Lombards were different because they attacked cities. So when they start attacking around the year 6, 7, 800, that's when we have a push of people going out into the lagoon who have money. And this is what's going to change the lagoon from people living in very crude houses to living in permanent structures that are very well done. So that's when they start learning how to create and craft the land in the lagoon to match what they want. So I wanted to point this book out to you. This is one of the most fantastic books if you want to pick something up. I think that they still have it. It came out maybe a dozen years ago. It's called Venice the Basics. And somebody took the time to hand draw in ink all of these wonderful cross sections and diagrams on how the city is put together. So this, I hope, gives you a sense about how the city was built. So originally, these 118 islands were just basically muddy hills. They were just a squishy kind of swampy land. You couldn't build anything directly on that because it's going to sink, especially if you're using stones. So they needed to figure out a way to really fortify that land before they built anything. So if you look at the bottom of that picture, you can see what looks like spikes. Those are all trees. Now, part of Venice in the past, Venice has a very easy access, and it was actually part of the Venetian Empire eventually. The Dolomites are right there. If I get in a car, I can drive up to the Italian Alps in about an hour and a half. So that meant that the people of Venice were very easily able to go up into the mountains, cut down the old growth trees, enormous trees, and bring them down log by log. And they used those as pilings. So one by one, if you can imagine, they drove these pilings into that muddy lagoon, and they created a platform. So the way it was built is they had the pilings, then a wooden platform on top of that. And then on top of that, they would put stone that was somewhat watertight, like not waterproof, but a watertight stone. And that created their foundation. On top of that, they don't build with stone. On top of that, they build with bricks. So anytime you're walking around Venice and you think a building is made of stone, you're very wrong. You wouldn't want to build a whole 3 or 4 story building out of stone because it would sink and it would put too much stress even on those major pilings. So instead, you would build in brick because brick was easily accessible. They could easily make that in the lagoon area, and they're light, they're porous, they don't weigh much, they float. Bricks float if you put them on water. So that's a very lightweight material, and that's what all of these buildings are made of. So something to think about anytime you see a picture of Venice. I always keep this idea in my head. Every single building you're looking at is built on top of an underwater forest. And these were put together very, very close, giant old growth forest, really, really close together, pilings one on top of the other. And this is how they put them in. This is a sketch an artist did when they were building new buildings. They would bring these trees out and they'd have this device that was like a giant hammer that was used by 2 men, and they would just slowly pound these things down into the lagoon. And that seems like a crazy amount of work, but that does tell you also how sandy and how pliable the lagoon is. So it shouldn't surprise you at all when you go to Venice if your door does not hang straight on your bedroom wall, and if your floor is not exactly flat, but maybe a little wobbly, because of course you're on top of a soil that's very, very spongy and moves around a lot. So another diagram, just if you didn't understand sort of that concept, I think this is a nice cutaway. So the foundations, you can see all of those tree trunks with a wooden platform, the watertight stone, and then on top of that, the brick buildings. And when you see the canals aren't, most of them are natural-ish, but a lot of them were more crafted, like a street. So that's why we really want to think about canals as streets, because they were purposefully, some of them dug so that you could get in between different parts of the city. Another important part of this particular diagram I wanted to show you is that some of you know, if you've been to Venice already, that the Venetians, of course, need water. It's the water everywhere, but not a drop to drink. You're in the middle of salt water, right? So how do you get water? My son asked me that this morning. Well, now if you visit Venice, you're drinking water pumped in from the Dolomites. It's some of the freshest, most delicious water in all of Europe. It's straight from glaciers in the Italian Alps. Back then, they couldn't do that. So what they did is created these big underwater tanks. So every single one of these 117, 118 different islands had a cistern. And when you walk through any campo, any square in Venice, you'll find them because you can see the little holes. They still exist, little holes in the ground that collect the rainwater. And then underneath that is sand. And then all of that flows to a cistern, a place that you can get the water from in the center. And almost every campo in Venice still has, it looks like a well. You know, you can go there. Most of them are locked or covered up, but you can still see these in Venice even today. Those were only shut down in the 20th century. That's what's kind of unfortunate. And if you think about it, what an easy way to cause some trouble. If you wanted to poison the well, it wouldn't have been too hard. So there was a time, though, that the Venetians realized that that wasn't enough. When the city actually did grow and had a huge population, they started shipping water over on boats as well. So, but this is the reason that Venetians today, if you go at 6 o'clock in the morning, 7 o'clock in the morning, the bars are full of old Venetian men drinking wine. It's because they still don't trust the water, right? Or at least that's the excuse they tell me. So how did a little fishing village turn into the Lion City? And that's what we often hear people call it, is a Lion City. Well, if we go to this is 600, like we talked about, and we saw the Venetians bop all over the lagoon. They went from one place to another and finally settled in the middle. The way they were able to do that is they started off thinking about business opportunities. And if you meet a Venetian person, business is in their DNA. They are the most enterprising of all Italians that I think I've ever met. They're very, very business oriented. So they started off by fishing because that's obvious. You know, you live in a lagoon, and actually they had sort of a monopoly on their fishing because they have a lagoon that's shallow. They had to build special boats, and only their boats could go in the lagoon because of how shallow it was. So fishing was their original business, but then they started to realize that they were in a great location for shipping. So they could ship things. It was a lot shorter to get to Venice from the Brenner Pass, for example, than it was to get to Aqua or Grotto, which were cities that existed prior to Venice. So it became more and more a place that people would bring their goods and they could ship them out from there. They also had a lot of room and they had a lot of boat building expertise. If you can't get to your neighbor's house without a boat, you're going to learn how to build boats pretty fast. And that became one of their great skills, was becoming the greatest boat builders that Europe had ever seen. So that became one of their main businesses as well. Unfortunately, one of the really big businesses that started to kickstart their economy was slaves. And not slaves necessarily from Africa, but from all over the Mediterranean. People would be brought in and then they'd be sold as servants. So it was pretty quick that Venice became a hub for all kinds of different trade up into Northern Europe. So the big break for Venice is going to come in the form of two different people, Constantine and Nisiphorus, who represent completely different takes on where Europe is going to go. You already know Constantine. I'm sure you do. I'm sorry, not Constantine, Charlemagne. I captioned this wrong. Charlemagne. It's supposed to be Charlemagne. So Charlemagne, you know, lived around the year 800. And his story, just in brief, is he's the king of the Franks, which is essentially France and Germany. He rises and unites Europe there. Once he does that, he starts expanding. He eventually wants to become the emperor of all of Europe, the first time since the ancient Romans left. So, you know, we haven't had an ancient Roman emperor in more than 400 years on mainland Europe. So he decides to start moving out and kind of consolidating his territory. Venice seems like a great city for him to own because, of course, having a shipping point for his Frankish goods would be really, really smart. So, of course, Charlemagne is going to start coming down and putting pressure on gathering up the Venetians. Now, at the same time, the Venetians had been establishing connections with the people in Constantinople. That's why I put Constantine, because I was thinking about Constantinople. So in the Far East, Constantinople is going to become the great empire. That was the most important city in the world at the time. So around the year 800, Constantinople was richer, had a bigger population, and it was just a more important city. So the Venetians were being shrewd about trying to keep good relations with both of them. But that changes because Charlemagne wants the city, wants to have it as a shipping hub. So he sends his son Pepin to siege the city to try and take it over. But of course, they hadn't bet on the lagoon. They didn't understand it. They sent a fleet of ships into the lagoon. and tried to attack and siege the city. And what happened to them? They ran aground, their ships tipped over, and the Venetians came out on their tiny little lightweight boats and killed everybody. It was an absolutely disastrous defeat for the biggest force in Western Europe. And it was an embarrassing defeat. And so that brought Charlemagne to the table to have a discussion with the Byzantine emperor in the East and say, look, we can't let them be independent. Like, that's not a thing. You have to be under the influence of the Holy Roman Emperor, the Pope, or the Byzantine Empire. The Venetians had no interest in being a part of the papal states. They have never wanted to be considered a religious city. They're really specific about that. So that was a no-go. They didn't really want to be attached to the north because that didn't make sense for their shipping empire. So they asked if they could become a child state of Byzantium. So when you think about it, that's great for them. But the other really great thing for them is, who's going to keep an eye on them? You know, you think about, where is Constantinople? That's a really far way away. So they essentially, by making that decision to be a child state of Constantinople, bought themselves their freedom. A little funny side, well, I don't know if it's funny, but kind of gross side story is that this particular Byzantine emperor, Nisiphorus, he ends up going on an adventure into Bulgaria because he tries to expand his territories. He's ambitious, and he ends up being assassinated by a Bulgarian leader, and then his skull becomes a glass for that particular guy to drink out of. So he meets kind of a grisly end, but he did liberate the Venetians. So when you look at the lagoon, again, you can kind of understand, this is just a contemporary aerial photograph. You can understand what a failure it was for the troops of Charlemagne and Pepin to try and attack. What a crazy idea, because it looks like the ocean, but you can see with all that light turquoise, all of that is extremely shallow, extremely shallow. So people could get in through the bars, this kind of slots on the side of the Lido. You could get your boats into the lagoon, but if you tried to go anywhere near the island of Venice, you were going to run aground. And this is going to be the reason that for 1,000 years, this city will never be defeated. There will never be anybody who will defeat the city of Venice on its own home turf, because they can't. Nobody can attack this city. It's impossible. It's got the most fortified walls you can find, which is water. So that's part of the reason that they were able to stay independent. And this is an important point. They were an independent republic for 1,000 years. Did you know that? There's no other country in Europe that can claim that. France was not an independent republic for 1,000 years. I mean, Italy didn't even exist until the 19th century. So this was one of the most impressive cities in those terms, that it was an independent republic. And when I say republic, I mean that it never had a king. It never had a royal family. It was a city that was ruled by the people. So we think that we're very innovative in the United States for having a government ruled by the people. But the Venetians, they started that 1,000 years ago, and they let it last 1,000 years. So this is one of those moments I want you to take away from my talk today, is when we think about Venice, don't think about masks and gondolas. Think about the savvy and the shrewdness of a city that was able to create a system of government that was is more like an oligarchy, but still a republic that lasted 1,000 years. That hadn't been done anywhere in history before. So Constantinople became its sort of mother state, but they end up having a very strange relationship. But the reason I wanted to show you this little map is that Constantinople at that time, around the year 800, was actually kind of factioned. Constantinople was the hub, and it was a kind of a connector for all of these different kinds of places. So you think about, it was the link to Jerusalem. It was the link to North Africa. It linked all the different cities. It was the hub for all of the Mediterranean back at that time. So the city itself was kind of a little patchwork quilt. Each district of Constantinople hosted a different community. So that meant that there was a Venetian district. There was a district for the people from Genova. There was a district from the people from Syria. So if you go there today, some of you may have been to Istanbul, you'll actually walk through parts of town that have architecture that look like other parts of the world, because those people came and they built like what they saw in their own homeland. So it was really kind of the melting pot. It was the place everybody went. And so Venice ended up having kind of a little bit of a strange relationship with it because they needed Constantinople for the cover of saying, oh yeah, we're a child state, but they also really wanted to be their own thing. So what happens next? Now that Venice is its own town, it has this relationship with Constantinople, a really strong trade agreement since they're technically under the same government. Trade takes off. This becomes 100% the most important place to come and trade your goods. This is the Rialto Market, which some of you may have been to before. This right here was the Wall Street of ancient Europe. So if you went into Europe in the year 1000 and you wanted to go figure out, Western Europe that is, and you wanted to figure out what was the price of silk, you could go here and you could find out. If you wanted to buy a giraffe, you could do that. You would just have to go to the Rialto. Think of anything, spices, cloth, slaves, anything that you can imagine was sold here on the stock exchange, essentially, of Venice. So from about the year 1000 all the way up until the 14 and 1500s, this was the most important city in Western Europe for trade because it was right in between. They had everything. It was kind of the Costco, I guess you could say, of ancient or not Middle Ages Europe. And this was the place they did it, right here. If you cross that Rialto Bridge and you walk through that zone with all of those buildings, this is one of the oldest places in all of Venice. The church that you see on the left there, that church was established in the year 400. And so you can imagine for over 1,000 years, 2,000 years practically, but 1,600 years now, the birthday is soon, we've had people walking back and forth in front of this church, trading all kinds of different things. I always say that when I take my groups, because sometimes we go and it's crowded and there's tourists from all over the world and they're all talking in different languages and it's really kind of an assault because it just feels too much. That is correct. If that's the sensation you get walking through Rialto on a crowded day, you are having a historical moment because that's how that area has always been. If you go back, to 1200, it was going to be packed with people from all over the world coming to exchange their different products. It was probably noisy and busy and crazy, just in the same way that it is even today. And here's a little take on that. This is a Carpaccio painting. This is a little bit later in Venetian history, but you can see that is the Rialto Bridge, actually. You can see that wooden bridge. The current one was something that was built much later, but this particular wooden bridge, it was a drawbridge that could open up to let the tall ships get through when they had big ships coming through the Grand Canal. And you actually had to pay to cross it. So to enter into the marketplace at Rialto, it cost you money just to be able to walk on the floor and to be able to buy stuff or sell things. But you can see how crowded it was with all the people jockeying for place with their gondolas. And you see people, there's a religious procession going on up above and the bridge is packed. Do you see how many people are on the Rialto Bridge? So packed that eventually the reason they had to replace it is that it collapsed. Too many people on the bridge all at once. And they actually destroyed the bridge that way. So I hope that gives you a sense of sort of the hustle and bustle of how crazy Venice would have been in the past. It was such a busy trading hub. And at that time, traders came in all forms, and there are some mythical traders you might know about. One of the most famous stories from this time period, we're talking 11 and 1200s, is of course Marco Polo. I'm sure you've heard of Marco Polo, who decided that he wanted to figure out how to get more interesting products. This is what it's all about. It's all about how do we find the products and how do we bring them in and how do we sell them and take a profit. So this was one of the things that Marco Polo did. He went to the Far East. He ended up in the court of Kublai Khan, where he stayed for a very long time. He left when he was a child, came back to Venice, a very rich man, having gotten all these connections for trade, and he brought those connections to trade back to Venice so that they could sell their products from the East. And the famous funny story is that he knocks on the door. This is his house, apparently, they say. He knocked on the door of the house. His mother opens the door and he says, "It's me, Marco Polo. I'm here and I've been gone for so long." And the mom looks at him and says, "I don't know you," and shuts the door. He knocks on the door again and she says, "I don't know you." And he opens up his coat and his coat is completely covered in jewels and gold and riches. And his mom says, "Oh, Marco, welcome home. We've missed you so much." So that's one of my favorite stories of Venice during the 11 and 1200s. So 1,000 years as a republic. What exactly does that mean and how did that come to pass? It's all about money, for one thing, but we'll get to that in a second. When we look at the symbols of the Republic, you're always going to see the Lion of St. Mark. Now, this is something that was really important and still is to the Venetians, that they have the bones of St. Mark, one of the four evangelists. His symbol is always the winged lion. You'll see this on churches as well, just because that's a very typical symbol of one of the four evangelists. They each have an animal that represents them. But the lion with the wings is Venice. It's St. Mark. Every time you see this on a building, you'll also see a Bible. Do you see how his hand is on a book? Now, just a little key, if you walk through town, that is open or it's closed, depending on when that building was made or that image of the lion was made. If the book is open, it means it was a time of peace. If the book is closed and the lion has his hand on a book that is closed, it meant that it was a time of war. So just different symbolism, but this was very important to them. And in fact, this was not their first saint. The original saint of Venice was poor Saint Theodore. I feel so bad for Saint Theodore because he was their patron saint, but they decided he wasn't good enough for a city that is getting to be this important and this wealthy. So they needed to kind of upgrade. So they decided to go and find themselves a better saint. Now, somewhere in the gospel, it is interpreted that Mark came through the Lagoon of Venice. Probably not. He probably went to Aquileia because we already know nothing was in Venice. Doesn't matter. They interpreted it as the Venetian Lagoon, and he has a vision that says, Mark, this is where you will rest. Now, you can take that as being, you should sleep here tonight. The Venetians interpreted that as, that means his bones belong to us and they should reside in Venice. So a little liberal interpretation of the gospel. And using that, they sent their traders off on a mission. They went to Alexandria in Egypt, and they found the bones of Mark because that's where his bones had been left, and they purchased them. But how do you get them out of a country when, I mean, that's a pretty important thing. So what they decided to do was they decided to smuggle them out. The way they smuggled them out was to put them into a basket filled with pork. So that was what they did. They stuffed it with pork and they took it out through customs, and they were able to get the bones back to Venice without any problem. And that's what they're celebrating. This is the front of St. Mark's Cathedral, and they're celebrating that moment when they steal the bones of Mark from Alexandria and bring them back to his rightful home. So the city has its wonderful saint, and now it needs an avatar. We know about avatars now, but back in the past, most cities had sort of an allegorical figure. And I want to point this out because once they have Mark, once they're starting to gain their influence, they call themselves La Serenissima, the most serene. They become the most serene of all republics, and they are embodied by a blonde, fat woman with pale skin, which, man, I missed my day. That was considered the height of beauty back then, to be a blonde, fat woman who was big and wore pearls. The pearls, of course, were the symbols of the sea. So anytime you see a woman with this Venetian blonde, that kind of strawberry blonde hair, who's pale, you can tell that that's supposed to be just the allegorical figure of Venice. And in her hand, she's carrying the hat, the crown of the leader of Venice, the Doge. So just a little word about Doges. So Doges, I know we associate with Dogecoin now, but that's not where that word comes from. The word comes from dux, and dux was a title in the Byzantine hierarchy. There was a dux in Ravenna, south of Venice, but eventually when that whole thing crumbled, when Ravenna fell apart, the dux moved to Venice, and that became the leader of Venice and then transformed into the word Doge. The Doge is going to be elected from the wealthy families of Venice. So again, it's an oligarchy. It's not really a republic. It's an oligarchy, essentially. So we have all of these wealthy families. So how do they pick the person who's going to lead them? Now, they don't want them to be a king because it's a republic. So they take a vote. The way they took this vote originally, they called it an arengo, where around the year 800, they just had all of the wealthiest families, the men from the wealthiest families, gather in front of St. Mark's, and everybody would start screaming out the name of somebody that they wanted to lead them. And eventually, screaming the same names over and over again, they would all come to agree on a single name. That was the original way of doing this, which sounds kind of entertaining. I wish I could be there to see that. Very fun way to do it. And they'd pick their leader. That leader would then be the leader until the end of their lives. So that's how they would choose their leaders and all of that. And the leaders, of course, if you're going to pick somebody who's going to lead you for the rest of your life from amongst all these famous families, probably smart to choose a leader that is old. So most of the doges were at least in their 70s, which I know now is not that old, but back then that was quite old. Some of these doges were picked in their 90s. Venetians live a really long time. So this was a smart way for them to assure a very short stay in office for most of these doges. So that's how they pick them. And then this leader, they don't have a crown. They instead had this kind of funny little hat because they don't ever want to have any symbols of religion. They don't want to have any symbols of royalty. So they come up with a little bit different way to show off who they are. But the most important doge, in my opinion, is Enrico Dondelo. And I want to tell you his story a little bit, because this is the most important moment in Venetian history, in my opinion. Enrico Dondelo was, they don't know, either 75 or 85 when he became doge. Interesting little twist of fact, his dad lived to be in his 90s. And if back then, when your dad was still alive, you were still considered a minor. So you weren't a full adult until your parent had died. So he didn't become a full adult, and we don't see anything about him in records until he's in his late 60s, because he didn't exist before that. Before that, he was a child. Funny way to look at it. I like it. I'm still a child. I'll take that. So at that point, he becomes a full citizen of Venice, and he eventually is elected doge. They think that anywhere between his 70s and his 90s. They're not entirely sure about his age, but the description they have is that he was extremely old when he was made doge. But he was a firebrand. This guy was ambitious, and he fell in with the Crusaders. Now, the Crusades started around the year 1000, but this ended up being kind of the great business for Venice. How are you going to get to Jerusalem if you're a French Crusader? You're going to come down over the Brenner Pass, and you're going to try to get to the closest port that's going to take you out to the Middle East. You have choices, though. You can go to Pisa. That's another direction. You can go to Genova. You can go to Venice. Venice is by far the most convenient and the most cost-effective. And so that's where most of these crusaders want to go. So this group of French crusaders comes up, and they want to go and do their crusade. And so they jump in and say, hey, let's do this crusade, but we don't really have the money for it. Can you loan us some money? So he says, sure, the city's going to help you do this. It's going to be the largest crusade ever put on. So he puts the crusade together, and then it turns out, after they spend all of the city's money, that these crusaders don't have even nearly enough to pay for it. So the doge isn't quite sure what to do. Also, they were supposed to receive extra troops, but the extra troops didn't show up. So what happens is that they just decide to go on and do a crusade anyway. So he takes all of those troops who had shown up for a crusade, which is supposed to be going and killing the infidel in Jerusalem or North Africa, and instead he takes them to Zadar, or Zara in the Pass in Croatia. It was a Venetian city that had been naughty. It hadn't been following Venetian rules. So he takes them and he fortifies a city he already owns, basically, using those crusader troops, which doesn't seem right because that's a Christian city, but he does that anyway. In the meantime, while he's there, a young boy arrives in the city who is supposed to be the emperor of Constantinople. His name's Alexei. His uncle has usurped his throne, and he asks for help from Enrico Dondelo. Can you please come with me to Constantinople, throw out my uncle, and I will reward you with all the money to pay off this big debt you have. You're in so much debt. If you go back to Venice, you're going to be murdered. And that was probably correct. So he said, sure. And they went off and they attacked Constantinople. And something to know is at the time, there were 4 maritime republics, as I mentioned. It wasn't just Venice. It was Pisa, Genova, Amalfi, and Venice. These guys were always fighting against each other. So the reason that Enrico Dondelo said, sure, let's go to Constantinople, is that the Genovese in particular had been really cruel in trying to get rid of the Venetians. They didn't like the competition, so they were constantly fighting with the Venetians. The Venetians were getting too powerful, too rich. So all of these other maritime republics who had those neighborhoods in Constantinople were trying to throw them out. And they had been successful. They'd thrown the Venetians out, but then they got the Venetians reinstalled. And essentially, Enrico Dondelo assumed, hey, look, if I go to Venice or to Constantinople with this emperor, I can install somebody friendly to the Venetians, and I won't have to worry about these uprisings anymore. So they went off to Constantinople, and they did that thing that nobody could believe. they attacked a Christian city. That's not what crusades do. Crusades were not built to attack a Christian city, but they did it. They took down Constantinople, and when they were done, they installed somebody that was friendly to the Venetians. In this battle, the epic battle of Constantinople, they say that Enrico Dondelo at that time was about 95 years old and blind, completely blind, and he led the charge and with a sword in hand and walked off of the boat into the battle. Who knows if that's true? We do know that he did die there because he was quite elderly, and that was the end of his life. He is buried at Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, even to this day. So this is the pivotal moment, and we're talking about around 1200. This is the pivotal moment when Venice goes from being a child state of the most important city in the world to becoming the most important city, because now Constantinople was their puppet state. And how do you celebrate when your city becomes the ruler of the world? Well, you take everything. So they went through Constantinople and they took everything. So when you look at St. Mark's Church, which, by the way, is the personal chapel of the Doge. So the bones of St. Mark are not in a public church that's related to the Pope in Rome. It's a personal chapel for the Doge, which really pissed off the Pope in Rome, believe me. But they decorate all of the booty that they collected in Constantinople, and they put it on the personal chapel of the Doge. So all those columns that you see, the horses, the very famous horses, all of the decoration, the marbles, everything was stolen from Constantinople after the Fourth Crusade. So next time you go and you examine those columns, remember that these are things that were stolen from ancient Rome, essentially. So then they, of course, wanted to decorate and really glorify how incredible the Republic was, because this was something amazing that they had finally taken over everything in the world. And the stealing of these horses was quite significant because these were a symbol of the power of ancient Rome, and which had landed in the laps of the Venetians. They say that these horses used to have giant rubies as eyes. They've been stolen so many times, the rubies have disappeared, but can you imagine these horses completely gilded with giant rubies? They must have been something to see. So the Doge then has incredible power. They start building some incredible buildings. This is the palace of the Doge, but it's a big building like that, not because it's a palace of a king, it's the government building. The internal space, this is one of the largest open space rooms in all of Europe. It's an incredible site, and it was built like this because Venetian boat builders built the trusses. This is how good with wood they were. But this is the place where the government was run, and it was run like an oligarchy. You had all of these different people from the wealthy families come, and they needed an enormous space because at a certain point, there were just too many. And eventually, they had to actually close. They called it the Golden Book. They had to close the book that listed all of the famous families that could vote and have a voice in the government. So that caused a lot of political problems. But it was a multi-pronged system because you had the famous families in the Golden Book that could participate in the law, but then they also had what they called squale. And this is a squale of San Marco, and each of these squale were guilds. So if you were just a tradesperson, you could belong to a guild as well. So that gave you kind of a political power, like a trade union. So that was essentially how the city was run between the rich people and the people who were tradesmen. And then, of course, how do you enforce laws? Well, you make everybody a cop. That was their famous way of making sure people stayed within the law. They had these little mailboxes all over the city where you could denounce somebody in secret. You can say, I saw so-and-so steal 300 ducats from blah, 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 and you could put it in there, and then the government would investigate that. So a little bit of a creepy system, but that's the way they kept everything in line. And if you fell out of line, this was your fate. These are the dungeons, the jails in the palace. And actually, if you go in there, there's a beautiful room where they do the trials. And then there's a little door that goes into these horrible cells. These cells were used until the 1920s. Some of them are below the waterline. So people in Venice did not want to get crosswise with the law. And of course, building boats became a really big part of their business during this time, and they built special boats. I love this image because you can see that their boats were essentially flat on the bottom. They were made to be warships that could be used in the Adriatic in particular, and also in the Lagoon. And they became incredible boat builders. They built the arsenal. The Arsenale, today you can even go down there. It's still a functioning shipyard. This was the most important shipyard in all of Europe. The great story is that one of the kings of France came to visit in Venice. And they showed him at the beginning of the day a pile of wooden timbers. And they said, tonight you're gonna ride down the Grand Canal on this. And in one day, they built a warship and then sailed the King of France down the Grand Canal, giving him dinner at the same time. Now that sounds pretty impressive, but just to put it into historical scale, there's only ever been one other power in the world historically that was able to build a warship in a day. And that, my friends, is you and me, the United States during World War II. So consider that, if that gives you a scale of the immense power of the Venetians. The Arsenale became one of the most important shipyards ever built, and they and it was a big business for them. They could build all kinds of things. I wanted to show you this little clip. This is my friend Elisabetta Morelli, so you get a little bit more of a sense of the Arsenal, because this is such an important part of Venetian history, and you can't really go in there very much today, but we took a boat in there in September.
Buongiorno to everybody. I'm Elisabetta Morelli. I'm a local tour guide of Venice, and I'm going to show you some very interesting part of Venice, because you have the opportunity to be by boat, which is not so, typical. Now, from this hall, on the right-hand side, you are going to see something magnificent. This is the Shipyard of Venice, which is one of the very hidden parts of Venice, because it's a part of Venice that normally you cannot enter and visit. And if we are very lucky, we are going to see, but they're not any longer here, the boats for the race. This is the square of the shipyard where they were making the ships. And this is a place where they're keeping the boats for the historical race inside. The historical race takes place every year on the first Sunday in September, and is the most important race we have. The Shipyard of Venice is one of the three most important parts of Venice, which are St. Marco's Square, the political center of Venice since the very beginning, Rialto, the trading business center of Venice since the very beginning, and the shipyard where they were making ships for many different parts in Europe, but above all for themselves. And is divided into three parts. You can see a submarine on the left-hand side, because now is the seat of the Navy. And that's the reason why we cannot really enter the shipyard. We did something very special to be where we are, and now we need to get out, because it's not allowed to go over down there, where you can see a beautiful big boat for the race down there. The two towers in front of you are the ground entrance into the Shipyard of Venice, which is the seat of the Navy again, which is not possible to be visited. There is a part of the shipyard now rented to La Biennale of Contemporary Art, where they expose contemporary art every time the Biennale takes place, which is on the opposite side, that we cannot see it from the water, from where we are. Now we are getting out into the northern part of the lagoon, which is the oldest part of the lagoon, and in front of us, we are going to see the island of Murano. At the very beginning, it was one of the many islands using the lagoon for the refugees coming from the mainland, taking refugees to Venice. In front of us, we have a water bus passing by, because even the buses in Venice are different. We have water buses, because the only way to crisscross Venice is by water. So we are going to do something very special. Murano is the big island on the left-hand side, which became very famous since when? For the threat of fire, they moved all the glass-blowing factory once in Venice onto Murano Island. Why? Because obviously to melt the mineral oxides to make the glass, they needed fire. All the buildings in Venice are made in wood to be lighter, because Venice is built over muddy islands. That's why fire was burning very easily Venice in the past. That's why, to prevent the burning of the big town, they decided to move all the glass factory onto Murano Island, but also to better preserve the secret of how they were blowing the glass. We are always circumnavigating the shipyard, which covers 1/20 of the town because it's very big. These are the little houses belonging to the people working for the Navy. And on the left-hand side, instead, you can see plenty of different islands. As you can observe, we are following a very precise street. If I can speak about the street, obviously is a canal, which is very well delimited by le bricole, the wooden piles you are looking at on both sides, because the water of the lagoon is not deep enough to be crisscrossed everywhere. So canals, for the most, must be dredged every few years, because the movement of the tide is bringing in a lot of mud.
I hope you enjoyed that. Just a little mini escape to Venice. Doesn't that feel nice? You kind of feel like you're on the boat with Elisabetta. So, all right, so we're at the golden age. I know that I talked a long time, but this is, it really is the end, my friends. The golden age seems like this should be the part where we're the most happy here in Venice. They've conquered the world. They're the most important city in the Mediterranean. They have all the money. They say at this time, so between 1200 and 1400, there were at least 50 people living in the city of Venice as relatively wealthy as somebody like Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates. Can you imagine 50 multi-billionaires living in one city? The wealth is something that's almost impossible to understand. They did civic projects like this incredible calendar. This is, you've probably seen this before. Watch how these Moors, they call them, move. It's animated. They were able to do some really crazy projects. If you had arrived in Venice and seen a clock tower like this, you would have been shocked because at the time there wasn't anything like this. And on holidays, characters come out where the numbers are and they dance and move around. So it's like a kind of glockenspiel tower like you might have seen in Germany. But going back to the time that that was built, that was something incredible. Like I said, people from all over the world. And just in this little slice of a Carpaccio painting, you can see a Hasidic Jew from Jerusalem. You can see somebody who looks like a Moor from North Africa. And everybody lived together peacefully because it wasn't about religion and it wasn't about race. It was about one thing. It was about money. That's why everybody was here. And it gave Venice the ability to be a cosmopolitan city where people of different races and beliefs and religions and everything and different social classes could all be together in one space, which is something phenomenal. That's nothing unusual to us, but that's something phenomenal. And they kept the Doge at bay. I mean, they kept their ruler in his place. If you look at this painting of this really fancy procession, you can only see the Doge if you look in the very far corner on the right-hand side. There's a little guy wearing a white robe. That's the leader of the town. So that tells you about how they felt about politics and religion. Religion was important, but not religion as it relates to the Pope. They didn't want any rulers at all. Their Doge was even at the back of the line during processions. So the city became absolutely glorious. Most of these buildings that you see here were built at that time, and some of them were fully gilded. Can you imagine every one of these buildings on the Grand Canal being completely covered in gold? Some of them were covered in mosaics. Some of them were covered in paintings by famous artists. Most of that stuff, of course, is gone because of the humidity. Unfortunately, we don't see it that way anymore. But they built incredibly impressive palaces because they had so much money. You could build, this is just a staircase. This family decided to spend a lot of money on a neat staircase because they had all the money in the world to do this stuff. The architecture style became so kind of outlandish with people kind of, vying over who could have the most beautiful house. But remember, these houses are businesses. So when you look, every single palace has the same structure. That lower area, that's where they have the shipping. That's where you come in on your boat and you meet with somebody. They take you up to the piano nobile, the first floor, and that's where they take you and they wine and dine you. You never get up to the upper floors because that's where the family lives. But those first two floors are for shipping your goods and making business deals and entertaining guests. That's why every single Venetian house looks the same. They have the same structure. Lower floor is business, upper floor is entertainment of the business guests, and then the top floors are for the family. So put yourself in this video back to, let's say, the year 1400 and imagine you'd see the same gondolas, of course, but they were actually out there for transportation. But all of these buildings absolutely gloriously decorated in a way that it would be hard to even imagine today. They had other businesses besides trade. Of course, we know of the glassblowing industry, which started, as Elisabetta mentioned, and this was one of the only places in the world you could get a certain kind of glass because they had all the ingredients. Because glass, to make colors, you need different kinds of additives. This was a trading hub. They had access to all the materials they could possibly want. So the Venetians came up with a certain kind of glass that you could not get anywhere else. And in fact, nobody outside of Venice knew the secret of how they made this glass until Dale Chihuly, because Dale Chihuly's teacher escaped from Venice essentially, and he taught everybody their secrets. But up until that point in the 1960s and 70s, nobody knew how to make Venetian glass like this. So their glass was extremely valuable. Painting became fantastic during this time because if you have all the money in the world, what are you going to do with it? You're going to spend it on beautiful things. So art, they had money to spend on all these artists. Bellini is one of my favorites. He's sort of like the Botticelli of Venice, very delicate art. And then moving on to Giorgione, who is one of the, I mean, I could talk for 2 hours about Giorgione. He's a very interesting painter of the Renaissance. And finally with Titian, who is sort of their highest form of painter. He is the Michelangelo, that's analogous to Michelangelo in Venice. And he really took the art form to a different dimension. Something interesting to note, the Venetians are the reason that oil painting went everywhere because, of course, they had the Flemish people from the north coming in. They were a trade hub. So they brought new knowledge and they were able to mix techniques and things like that. So that's why Venetian painting has a little bit different look than some of the other contemporary paintings of the time. But it can't last forever. Nothing can last forever. It is the end of the world as we know it. And why? What happens? There's a reason that Venice is not Manhattan right now. This was the extent of the Venetian Empire at the time. Underneath the Venetians, there were over 1 million people. I think it was about 1.5 million people that considered themselves Venetian in the year 1500. That's a lot of people for then. The city itself had probably 150 to 160,000 people compared with less than a third of that today. So this was their empire. They were a country. They weren't just a city, they were an actual empire. They went way inland, and actually they were inland until the 19th century as well. So if you ever go to Croatia, you ever go to Albania, Slovenia, all of those coastal cities, they look like Venice because they were Venetian. But something unfortunate is going to happen to Venice. There's going to be 2 really critical things that's going to kill them off. First of all, the Constantinople falls to the Turks in 1453. That is a huge blow to the Venetians because that was their town. That was their main city, and it was a really big part of their power to have the connection to that. The other thing that's going to be a problem for them is they really pissed off the wrong people. I went back and told you a couple times about those 4 maritime republics, Amalfi, Pisa, and Genova. All of this time, the Venetians were kind of gobbling away at the Mediterranean, establishing their ports. And it did not go unnoticed by these other competing cities. So what do you think they wanted to do? They were trying to figure out a way to cut off the Venetians at the knees. The Venetians started charging taxes on anything that passed through the Mediterranean. If you wanted anything from anywhere, the Venetians were going to take a cut of it. So that did not sit well with all of these other city-states in Italy that wanted to be a part of the trading game. So they were constantly looking for ways to get rid of the Venetians, either throwing them out of Constantinople, attacking them, like at the Battle of Lepanto with Genova. I mean, all of these different ways, they tried their best to kill the Venetians and they couldn't do it. What's the best way to kill the Venetians? Well, what's it all about in Venice? It's about the money. How do you cut off the money? Well, there's one way. Find a better place. So, did you know where Columbus is from? Did you know he's not Spanish? I'm sure you knew he wasn't Spanish. Do you know where he's from? He's from Genova. The reason that Columbus went looking for a route to the West Indies was not because he thought it would be neat to please the Queen of Spain. It's because he hated the Venetians. And he was looking for a way to kill Venice's deadlock on the Mediterranean. And so he wanted money to be able to find some other way to get to India and China that did not involve passing through Venetian territory. That's why he did it. So you can thank the Venetians for where you live now, because you might not live there had that not happened. But that was the reason. But he wasn't the exclusive reason. This guy was more important. This is Vasco Da Gama. And what he did is he found the route around the Cape of Good Hope in Africa. And once he does that, it's such a fast route from Portugal down around the southern point of Africa up to India. The winds are good. It's simple. It's easy. After that, nobody sees any point or need to go through the Mediterranean. And that is going to kill off Venice, because at that point, who needs Venice? Nobody needs Venice. Everybody wants to work with the Portuguese now because the Portuguese have a cheaper, faster, easier way to get goods. But you know what? The Venetians don't care. Do you remember how rich I told you they were? Yeah, they're still going to be rich even after that stuff happens. So what do? They kind of start to just enjoy life. they sit down and have glasses of wine more often, and they kind of party it out for the next couple of 100 years. So 1492, Columbus sails the ocean blue, and you can think in your mind, that's the death knell for Venice. Venice is done as a major player in the world, and they're just going to party it out. Now, tourism, you think that tourism now is a really big piece of the Venetian economy, and what a tragedy for them. Tourism has been their main business since the 1600s, more or less. So they start to have these decadent parties. Carnival was always a part of their tradition, but they start to have Carnival almost half a year, 6 months a year. It's only supposed to be like a week. It went to 6 months a year. And they invited people from all over the world to come and misbehave. Then we end up having characters like Veronica, Franco, and Casanova popping up. Veronica Franco was a poet and a courtesan, very powerful Venetian woman. They said that there were something like 30,000, 40,000 courtesans in Venice at one point or another. So if you can imagine, you had all of these characters from all over the world. And remember, they were not kind of underneath the Pope. They were an independent city-state, an independent republic. They had whatever rules they wanted, and whatever rules they wanted were basically no rules. So you could come and do whatever you wanted in Venice. That was unique in the world. The decadence kind of flowed over into the way they looked. We had beautiful artists during that time. This is a woman named Rosalba Carriera, and she documented all the people in their gorgeous outfits. The architecture of the time became sort of more and more ostentatious and crazy looking. But if you look closely at it, it's all sticks and tape. These palaces are made of such poor materials. They look fancier than the other ones, but actually they're not. They were made with fake marble. They couldn't afford the good stuff anymore. Music, of course, is going to be a really big part. And you all know of Vivaldi. Vivaldi is, of course, with the Four Seasons, one of the favorites. But there are other artists that came to Venice and played a lot of music. You may have heard this before. This is Albinoni. Have you heard of Albinoni? So the 16 and 1700s were full of artists and musicians and courtesans and secret romance and dark alleyways and architecture. So we have architecture. People have so much money, they want to have a country house. So they hire a man named Palladio, and they have him build these beautiful, fancy country houses that are so inspirational to future architects. Your state capital is probably modeled after this very building. This is the Villa Rotunda, which is near Vicenza. So architecture, I mean, they have so much money, why not? Let's have a country house now, that'd be fun. Again, these are terribly made. They're made of sticks and tape and they fall apart instantly, but they're beautiful to look at. And this, I think Palladio buildings on the mainland are the perfect symbol for the decadence and the decay of Venice through the 15, 16, 1700s. It's just literally falling apart. The British start coming and staying. The Canaletto comes and paints all these beautiful paintings. The Queen of England has the largest collection of these, but he documents sort of the slow decline. And the view of Venice is becoming more and more that they are kind of something of the past. I mean, that colonial British kind of view of, oh, look how cute the savages are. It tells you something about where Venice has gotten to at that point. And the casino. The casino, the word casino, that's a Venetian dialect word, actually. Did you know that? If you go to the casino in Las Vegas ever, it's because the Venetians invented that. Casino means the little house. So they'd have a little house behind their palace where you could go and do whatever you wanted to, including gambling. And then those carnival masks, as I was talking about, have you ever thought about why they wear masks? It was because they wanted to protect their identity. So when they had festivals, people could dress up however they wanted and do whatever they wanted with whomever they wanted, which meant that there was a cross in society. Like if you were a lower class person, you could dress up and go have your little romance with somebody from an upper class if you wanted to, or you could behave in any way you wanted to. It became Las Vegas. The whole, if it happens here, it stays here concept, that started in Venice way before. But the party's going to end. And the party ends in the way that we're experiencing right now, by plagues. They have a problem with plagues. And unfortunately, plagues keep hitting Venice over and over again throughout the 16 and 1700s because they're getting lax. You're supposed to stop and take, oh, these are my kids dressed as plague doctors, by the way, which I think is This was before the pandemic, the coronavirus pandemic, and I think it's a little creepy they came up with this costume idea, to be honest. When you arrived in Venice, you were supposed to stop at the Dogana, at the customs house, and they were supposed to inspect you. And if they thought there was something wrong with your boat or your merchandise, they'd send you out to one of these quarantine islands. And you would sit there with your boat and your goods, and then you would wait. The funny thing is they would disinfect things they thought were suspicious, but not people. They didn't care about the people. They would disinfect the goods. Because remember, it's all about the money. So they're more concerned about the goods on the boat than they are about the people. But if you didn't want to do that, you had a deadline for your goods, you could pay money and you could get by. And that's how these plagues arrived over and over again in Venice. This church called La Salute is the most famous image probably in Venice. This was built in the 1600s after one of the many, many plagues that came through through Venice. So the mask you see with the doctor like that is a symbol of Venice, partially because they had so many people from different parts of the world that brought all kinds of different things in, which we're learning today. That's not so far away from what's happening now. Also, kind of to figure out what to do about all of this pestilence, the guilds started to bind together and provide relief. They didn't have health insurance. So a lot of these guilds would provide the sort of medical assistance and help to people who had become widowed or what have you. This is San Rocco, one of the squale, the guilds. And the saint that they picked was very specific because he is a patron saint of plague victims. So this becomes a really big part of the 1600s, 1700s Venice, this constant issue with plagues. And then they start to have other problems. The clouds really start to roll in. The city is going underwater, literally and figuratively as well. And then we have a very small Frenchman arrive that really causes the end of Venice. This is the end of our story. Venice was an independent republic for 1,000 years. And how did it end? It ended with a whimper. Unfortunately, Napoleon, after his campaigns to unite France and marching all over Europe, he decided to enter into Venice. And in researching this talk, I learned some new things about Napoleon. I wish I hadn't. Anybody in Venice, they don't even want you to speak the name of Napoleon. He was one of the worst things that ever happened to Venice. When he rolled into Venice, it was a pretty big fanfare. This is actually a painting of his arrival in Venice. I don't know where this triumphal arch is or was. I think it's probably fake, but they had a grand entrance for him. And what you see there in this painting is the carting away of those horses from St. Mark's. You can see the scaffolding on the church where they took them away from, and they're lowering one. Do you see that? They're lowering a horse from there. This was the symbol of the subjugation of Venice. Napoleon had the grand idea that he was going to lead his empire from Venice. And so he took on a huge project of renovating the city. He tore down hundreds of churches. Remember, every single island had at least one church. So he tore them down. He did some things that were good, like he moved all the dead bodies out to a funeral island, which is sanitary, so that was smart. But he also took 7,000 works of art from Venice, most of which have never been returned. Those horses he stole, he took them to Paris, and he put them where? On the top of the Arc de Triomphe. So these poor horses, which were originally from maybe Greece, we're not sure, but probably Rome, which were then moved to Constantinople and then taken after the Fourth Crusade and put onto St. Mark's Basilica, ended up in Paris, always the symbol of the greatest dominating power. These horses have something that people always want. And this building at the end, you can see with the windows all lit up, that was going to be his house. He was going to become Emperor of Europe, and he was going to rule Europe from St. Mark's Square. So they specifically tore down a church that was there and then rebuilt what is now the Museo Correr. That was going to be his personal residence. And the kind of joke amongst tour guides, it's not a joke though, is there's a space. If you look on the very top of the building, you can see statue, 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 but in the middle, there's just an emptiness there. There's no statue. That's because it was supposed to be a monumental statue of Napoleon, symbolizing his dominance over the city. He was going to rule Europe with St. Mark's Square as his living room. One of the great tragedies is that a lot of those artworks he stole have never been returned. This is a Veronese painting, which was stolen from Venice. It was on San Giorgio Maggiore, which is the island just out in front of St. Mark's, out in the lagoon. This is a huge painting, and it's in the Louvre. It had never been returned and is considered to be, get this, I didn't even realize this, the most valuable painting in the Louvre collection. even more valuable than the Mona Lisa. And it actually faces the Mona Lisa, or used to, in the room that it was displayed. So this Veronese painting belongs to Venice, but the French are never going to return it. So this is just one of 7,000 pieces of monumental art that were taken from Venice. And so that's why people of Venice despise Napoleon, and they can't even speak about him because of the damage that he did. He tore down so many churches and stole a lot of their heritage. So after that, poor Venice was sort of left at its knees once Napoleon was defeated. And so who gets Venice is the question. Well, look who's north of them. This is a map of the 1800s. It was the Austrians. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was kind of all around them, so they were absorbed into the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And the Austrians didn't actually rule for all that long, but we have something great to thank them for: bridges. All those footbridges that you've walked over all over Venice, those were built by the Austrians, because the Austrians looked at what a mess Napoleon had made of the island, and so they organized it. They added bridges, they built a train bridge, they started the train station, so they really actually put some good infrastructure in. Of course, the Venetians hated that, and they rebelled a few times, and eventually they actually joined the country of Italy, but they joined last. One little quirky thing, you've been here, I'm sure. This is Piazza Venezia in Rome. So Venice Square in Rome. The reason it's called that is that building on the left-hand side, that was the Venetian embassy to the Holy See. So in the past, the Venetians were literally a different country. They were not part of Italy. They had their own embassy. Eventually, though, in the late 1800s or 1870s, 1872, I believe it was, they did eventually join the new country of Italy, and they became a part of the Italian state. Venice today, well, it's a great place to eat black pasta. It's a great place to see amazing modern art, or not amazing modern art. Some amazing modern art. There's a lot of great artists. There's a huge artist community. You may not know it. There's a contemporary artist community living in Venice, a really strong part of their economy. Traditional crafts still continue. They are still making gondolas. They're still trying to eke out a living doing traditional things. And people who are keeping up the craftsmanship of glass and things like this. These are friends of mine who do glass jewelry. And people just live here. This is a place that normal people still live. You just don't own a car, you own a little boat. Most boats are not ostentatious, they're just these little paddling boats. So there is a community, like I said, about 55,000 people who still live on the islands. Some of the islands are a little more colorful than others, but it is still a living, breathing city just by the skin of its teeth. They love their beach, even if their beach is, I think, a little depressing. They've definitely still got their Venetian lifestyle. So the last thing I wanted to leave you with today is the one thing I didn't talk about: gondolas. I know you all love the gondolas. You've probably all been on gondolas, but the gondolas, of course, were the main mode of transportation. They used to be colorful. And at a certain point, they got so outlandish and colorful when all of these people had so much money, of course, they're going to soup up their car, that the government of Venice mandated that they had to be black because it was getting too crazy with all the different colors. So they made it by law, all of them have to be black. Gondolas today are custom made for each of their drivers based on their weight, because they're not straight lines. They're actually kind of a twisted boat, so you can row with one oar. And on the front, there's always this same symbol. The symbol, now you know that you've seen, that top thing is the hat of the Doge. Can you see the hat of the Doge? Underneath, we have the bars. The 6 bars represent the sestieri, the 6 districts of Venice, and the one that faces backwards represents St. Mark's. So that's the symbol. So what I'm going to leave you with today is a little boat ride. Let's go on a little gondola ride to say goodbye to our understanding of Venice. And I hope next time you go to Venice, you can take some of the things I've talked about with you, and you don't see it as a place that's just tacky and touristy and full of people. It should be that way. It's always been a little tacky. It's always been a little touristy, but it's always been romantic, and it's always been an important place. So think about that next time you go to Venice, that it's more than the sum of its parts, and it has a history that's far more interesting and noble than most people will let on. Well, there you go, my friends. I hope you enjoyed. My talk today. Does anybody have any questions? You can put them in the chat or raise your hand if you want. I'm going to unmute you if you would like. You can unmute yourself. All right. So did you guys enjoy yourselves? Oh, question. Did Venice ever get the gates to work to prevent the Aqua Alta? That's a great question. In fact, they did. This is the thing that's so incredible is that the Moses project, they just started working it about, I would say, not 6 months ago in November. And one of my best girlfriends that lives there, she told me that the Aqua Alta gates shockingly were able to keep the water out. It still lets a little bit of water in, but certainly keeps it from being a huge disaster. So this is one of the most stunning things because we all thought it was never going to work. Nobody believed that the gates were going to actually work. The problem now that they have is how often are they going to raise them? Because when I started tour guiding, I think that there were something like 60 Aqua Alta days per year. Now it's 180, which is any measure of water in front of the doors of St. Mark's, but it's so much more frequent. The problem is every time they raise the gates, it costs a lot of money. So the city needs to decide how often they're going to raise them. Is it only going to be in the most dire circumstances? And what's the bar? And a lot of the citizens were pretty upset because it really worked the first few days and they were so excited. And then like a week or two later, there was another Aqua Alta that wasn't as high and they didn't raise them. So it's a work in progress, but that's a great question. All right, anybody else have questions? Thanks, Patricia. Yeah, it is comprehensive. I know I talked a lot longer maybe than I anticipated, but like I said, this is basically a week's worth of information I condensed down into one presentation. So
no, it's great. And I'm not in Italy.
You're not? Where are you?
I'm in Portsmouth, New Hampshire.
Oh, no. Okay.
No, well, I'm hoping to get back to Bologna this fall, but the way Bologna is rossa right now, so who knows?
Yeah. Well, I'm hoping soon. The problem, of course, everybody I talk to in Italy is feeling very grim about things reopening because they're watching all of us get vaccinated and they're saying that, you know, there's no possibility for them there. So it's tough, but I am optimistic. I'm always optimistic. Yeah, so
I keep it that way. So that's why I'm here watching things.
Yeah. Well, good. And I hope that y'all learn something. So when you go back, you can look at it in a slightly different way, more context. So. Va bene. Okay, well, I want to thank everybody. Unless you guys have any other questions, I want to thank you all for coming. And this is, again, the second presentation for Guide Collective Presents. This is, I'm excited about this new thing because we're all thinking about new ways we can present things and also do fundraisers for Guide Collective. So thank you for supporting Guide Collective this week. Next week, I believe that it's going to be, I want to say my friend Helen is going to be doing high tea. So I think that's her presentation next week. But I'll have that up on Facebook later today with the presentation for next Saturday. And then Trish is going to be doing a presentation on unknown Paris, and that's in 2 weeks. So we hope you guys will join us for one of those. Question, do I think I'll run the Veneto and Slovenia tour in October? I feel pretty enthusiastic about it. I'm not personally guiding that one though. That's going to be run by my friend Marian, who you might know from Rick Steves. He was a Rick Steves colleague. He's a fantastic, actually you'll like him better than me. I like Marian better than I like myself. So yeah, as long as Italy opens, it could be another one of these cases, though, that we have to kind of pivot. It could be a Slovenia only tour if only Slovenia is open. So we're just going to have to wait and see what happens. But I've got a lot of tricks up my sleeve for the fall. So if you really want to travel in the fall, even if Italy doesn't open, we're lining up 2 or 3 other things that are alternatives. So you can jump on, if you're reserved on one tour, you can jump off that tour and onto something that is running in the fall. I can't imagine that Italy can continue like this, though. You know, just from a financial point of view, there's a lot of grumbling about that because businesses are going out of business left and right. One thing I didn't mention in the presentation today, just because it is a little depressing, my friend Stacy, I talk to her pretty frequently, and she says if you walk through Venice right now, every store is closed practically. She said that like the restaurants are all closed. They're back in the red zone as of Monday, I think. So they can't go anywhere or even really leave their houses unless they're just going to the store, which has just killed businesses. So it's making things really tricky for a lot of people. And the longer it goes on, the more destruction. So I'm just really happy I have some intrepid travelers who are ready to be the first people on the plane. So we've got our Venice tour scheduled for the end of August, which we're going to cross our fingers and toes for and hope that turns out, but it'll be fun. I can't imagine how cool it's going to be if we're the first people back in Italy. That will be really neat. How do I join the Guide Collective to see some of the upcoming presentations? If you go to our Facebook page, it's the Guide Collective Facebook page or Guide Collective, it's guide-collective.com. And for those of you who are here today who don't know me, I was a Rick Steves tour guide for more than 20 years, and I split off from Rick Steves in the spring and started up this Guide Collective, and I'm the director of Guide Collective, and I've gathered up all of my favorite colleagues, and we present all kinds of cool events, plus we have a travel magazine that is published once a month. So lots of great things over on Guide Collective. I'm super proud of all of my colleagues working so hard on that project. I can't believe they trust me that much. Maybe they shouldn't, but anyway, I'm always full of crazy ideas, and I can't believe I have 25 people following me. So it's pretty cool. Anyway, my friends, hoping I can pivot in August for something last minute. And I do want to tell you, if you do want to travel with me this fall, please stay tuned because I am ready to turn on a dime. I am prepared to travel and we will find a place. And I just want to let you know, Romania is almost 100% a go, and we still have spots open in October. Iceland is almost 100% to go, and I think we still have a couple spots open that September. And then if all the Italy stuff falls apart, I'm talking this week to my Turkish colleagues, and we are going to try to put together some alternatives in Turkey so that if none of the Italy stuff can go, everybody who's planning to travel with me to Italy, we can go to Turkey. So that's the idea. I'm thinking like a coastal Turkey and an Istanbul and environs tour, because I think that's interesting too, to explore, like we saw today, the links between Venice and Constantinople. So yeah, so don't worry, we'll get you going somewhere. You're already allowed to go to Turkey. Maybe you didn't know that, but you can go to Turkey tomorrow if you want to. Egypt is also open, and they are starting to resume their group tour business this next month. So Hoda just called me the other day and said, why don't you put an Egypt tour out for the fall? So that's another alternative if Italy doesn't open up. So we're looking at Egypt and Turkey, and I think Croatia should be fine. And so the Taste of the Adriatic tour that we've put together, that should probably run also. Okay, any other questions? All right, you guys, thank you for listening to me. I love talking about this subject, and it has been lovely having this many people. You know, my former husband used to always say that I went to work because that I could find people who wanted to listen to me talk about this stuff. Because I like it a little bit too much. But if you're interested in any further information about learning about Venice or any of the source materials for my talk today, please just send me a message. I can send you a list of some great books. Of course, I've learned over time, but I do have a couple of really great books I can recommend for you. If you really dive into Venice, I really have a passion for the city now that I understand it. Before I didn't like it, you know, and I really feel like once you understand it, that's how you fall in love with it. So anyway, thanks everybody. And I will see you. Oh, hey, sorry, before we go, everybody who's a Patreon sponsor, remember tonight, I know it's late, but at 9 o'clock, the Emirati Tourism Board is giving us a free tour of Dubai. I don't know if I can record it because it's through the government. I'm going to try, but please, if you can, 9 o'clock Pacific time, we're going to offer that free tour, and the link is already up on Patreon. Please do join us for that. That's a
and we lose an hour tonight too.
Well, no, it happens before the time change. 9 o'clock is before.
I know, but still, if you stay up to 1 a.m.
Yeah, I hope I can record it. I just can't guarantee it, but I do hope you can join me because that's going to be a really cool event. So, all right.
Yeah,
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Ciao.
Bye.